Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're tackling something pretty fascinating. How the history we get taught in school is always changing. And is it even the whole story?
Just think back to your own history class for a second. That version of the past you memorized for the test? Well, it turns out it's not set in stone at all. It's always being updated. So what kids are learning right now could be totally different from what you learned. And you can bet it'll be different again in the future.
And look, we're not just talking about fixing simple mistakes, like getting a date wrong on a timeline. Nope. This goes way deeper. We're talking about the entire narrative we're taught, the very story that really shapes how we see ourselves and where we think we come from.
Okay, so let's really get into the nitty-gritty here. If we're going to understand how history can change so much, we first have to get on the same page about what we even mean by a historical inaccuracy. It's not as simple as you might think.
Yeah, it's actually a pretty broad term. Sure, it can be a straight-up wrong fact. That's the easy one. But way more often, it's about what's been left out of the story. The omissions, the oversimplifications, or the biases that kind of give you only one side of a really complex event.
So basically, you've got these four big ways a historical story can get, skewed. And look, a wrong fact is pretty easy to spot and fix. But it's the stuff that's missing, the omissions and the biases, that are way harder to catch. And honestly, they can have a much bigger impact on how we end up understanding the past.
All right, so let's make this real. Let's look at how this actually works with a huge example, the American Civil War. Seriously, the way this story has been told in classrooms has changed so dramatically over the years, it's kind of mind-blowing.
And just look at how big this shift is. For a really long time, a lot of schools taught that the Civil War was mostly about states' rights. But today, the historical consensus is crystal clear. The war was, at its very core, about the institution of slavery.
So you gotta ask, right? Where did that whole states' rights thing even come from? Well, a huge part of it was shaped by this really powerful and really influential interpretation of history called the lost cause narrative.
So this was a story that was pushed, promoted by former Confederate leaders and other groups for decades after the war ended, and what it did was completely reframe the Confederacy's defeat. It basically painted their cause as this heroic, noble fight for independence. And this is the crucial part. In doing that, it intentionally pushed the central role of slavery way into the background.
But it's not always about twisting the story, right? Inaccuracies aren't always about reinterpreting what happened. Sometimes the most powerful ones are about what's not said at all. Yeah, what gets left out of the history books can be just as important, if not more so.
Let's take westward expansion, for example. For decades, the story we were told was all about heroic pioneers fulfilling their manifest destiny. This idea that the U.S. was destined to stretch from coast to coast. But that heroic tale almost completely ignored the perspective of the indigenous peoples who were being violently displaced. The modern approach is all about telling a much more complete and, frankly, more honest story by actually including their experiences.
And you see the same kind of thing with the civil rights movement. When we learn about it, the lessons tend to focus on a few really iconic leaders. Now, don't get me wrong, their leadership was absolutely vital, but focusing only on them, it really oversimplifies what was a massive grassroots movement driven by thousands and thousands of ordinary people in communities all across the country.
So, when you see these huge shifts in the stories we tell, it naturally leads to a pretty big question. Why do they change? And maybe more importantly, who's actually in charge here? Who gets to decide which version of history ends up in our kids' schools?
Well, a huge piece of the puzzle is textbooks. Think about it. They're usually adopted for an entire state or a whole school district, and that means they can end up pushing a single dominant point of view on millions of students all at once. And here's the real kicker. Textbooks get updated so slowly. It can literally take decades for new historical research and understanding to actually make its way into a classroom. So what does that mean? It means these outdated stories can stick around for a very, very long time, long after professional historians have moved on.
And then, of course, there's the political side of things, which has a direct impact on what's in those textbooks. What gets included in the curriculum is often this huge, fierce debate. It creates this constant tug-of-war between, say, what a state education board wants and what professional historians agree actually happened. So, okay, where does all this leave us? Well, the good news is things are changing. The way history is being taught is evolving, and there are some really big, positive shifts happening right now that are worth talking about. For starters, there's this huge push for more inclusion. The goal now is to tell a much more complete, a much fuller story. And you do that by bringing in the perspectives and experiences of all the people who were, for a long time, just kind of left on the sidelines of the main story.
And another big one is the new emphasis on critical thinking. The idea is to move way beyond just memorizing names and dates. It's about teaching students to actually think like a historian. To look at sources, to question the stories they're told, and to get that, hey, there are almost always multiple sides to every single story.
And finally, there's this growing understanding that history isn't just some dusty list of facts that's set in stone. It's actually a living, breathing conversation. It's something that's always evolving as we find new evidence, and just as importantly, as we start listening to new voices.
Which kind of leaves us with one last big thought to chew on. Everything that's happening in the world right now, that's tomorrow's history. And the stories we're telling about it today, you can bet they're going to be examined and debated and rewritten by the people who come after us. It just makes you wonder, doesn't it? What will they see that we just can't?